Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we do things here, taking a look at some really interesting sources. And today's topic, oh boy, is it a big one.
It's a big one.
We are talking about the Indo-Pacific
Yes.
and what a potential second Trump administration might mean for the region.
Huge implications. Yeah.
Huge implications. I mean,
Yeah.
this is like ripped from the headlines and also could very well end up on your UPSC exams.
Oh, for sure.
If you are an aspiring diplomat or just someone who likes to know what's going on in the world, this is a really fascinating one. So we've got a bunch of sources that are all talking about this and how really a lot of Trump's policies, especially from his first term, could really shake things up in the Indo-Pacific if he ends up back in the White House.
Right. And it is a region that's become increasingly important on the global stage.
Sure.
And with this potential change in U.S. leadership, things could get very, very interesting, particularly for a country like India.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. One of the, I guess, the most interesting developments during Trump's first term was this shift in terminology from the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
And it might seem kind of subtle, but it actually, I think, reflects a pretty significant change in strategic thinking.
Yeah, I think that's right. It may seem subtle at first, but when you think about it, including the Indian Ocean in the name, really acknowledges the growing importance of India as a regional power and underscores the interconnectedness of the two oceans.
Yeah.
Highlighting the importance of maritime security, freedom of navigation.
It's kind of like recognizing that what happens in the Indian Ocean can directly impact what happens in the Pacific and vice versa.
Right, exactly.
Especially when you think about all the trade that goes through that area.
Absolutely. All of those trade routes that pass through the region.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and
Wow.
the shift in thinking, it wasn't just symbolic. The U.S. actually renamed its Pacific Command to the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command.
Oh, right.
So structural changes like that really do show a commitment to the region. Yeah.
Especially as China's influence continues to grow.
Right. And speaking of countering China, we can't forget about the Quad,
Of course.
which really seems to have kind of gained momentum during Trump's first term, the grouping of the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia.
Yeah, it really did.
Yeah.
Before Trump, it was more of an informal dialogue. But under his administration, it evolved into a formal ministerial level engagement, which really, I think, signaled a growing concern among these countries about China's actions in the region, particularly in the South China Sea.
So it's kind of like they realized they needed to actually team up to counter China's growing
Yeah.
assertiveness.
Exactly. And this really set the stage for the Quad to become even more prominent in the years that followed.
So before we get too deep into what a potential second Trump term could look like, I think it's important to note that even under Biden, the Indo-Pacific didn't exactly, fade into the background,
Not at all. In fact, Biden actually elevated the Quad to a leaders' summit.
further solidifying its importance in U.S. foreign policy. It shows there is that bipartisan consensus in Washington about this crucial role of the Indo-Pacific.
But Biden did bring kind of his own flavor to the U.S. approach in the region, didn't he?
He did. Under Biden, the Quad's agenda expanded to include issues like climate change and vaccine distribution.
Yeah.
So it really kind of reflects a broader understanding of security in the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
It's not just about military power, but also about addressing these transnational challenges.
And then, of course, there's Biden's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, as everyone likes to call it. Can you remind us what that was all about?
Yeah, IPEF, it was Biden's attempt to counter China's economic influence in the region. It aimed to build more resilient supply chains, promote fair trade practices, and strengthen those economic ties between the U.S. and its Indo-Pacific partners.
So by the time we get to a potential second Trump term, there's already a lot going on in the Indo-Pacific. But according to our sources, things could get even more, to say, interesting.
Interesting is one way to put it. I mean, the source material suggests that a second Trump administration might take a much more confrontational approach towards China.
Oh.
Potentially viewing them not just as a competitor, but as a full-blown adversary.
Okay, so are we talking about a new Cold War brewing in the Indo-Pacific?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Imagine increased freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, expanded sanctions against Chinese companies, and perhaps even more direct pushback against China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Wow, this is really starting to feel like a geopolitical thriller.
Yeah.
So where does the Quad fit into all of this? It seems like it would play a pretty key role in this more assertive U.S. strategy.
Absolutely. The Quad, it's predicted to become much more operational under a second Trump administration.
So what does that look like in practice? Like more joint military exercises, increased intelligence sharing.
All of that and more,
Yeah.
We could see coordinated responses to maritime security threats, joint development of military technology, and even the deployment of more U.S. military assets to the region.
It really sounds like a pretty clear message to China that the U.S. and its allies are not backing down.
That's one way to interpret it, but it's not just about the Quad. Our sources indicate that deepening defense ties with individual allies like India, Japan, and Australia will also be a priority.
So we could see more technology transfers, joint training exercises, even co-production agreements for weapons systems.
Exactly. The goal would be to bolster the defense capabilities of these allies,
Yeah.
making them stronger partners in countering China's influence. It's about building a network of like-minded countries that can push back against China's assertiveness.
Okay, so it sounds like a lot of focus on, military might.
Yeah.
But our sources also seem to emphasize the importance of economic and technological alliances as well, right?
We do. It's not just about warships and fighter jets. It's
Yeah.
also about who controls the technologies of the future.
So things like artificial intelligence, 5G networks, cybersecurity.
Exactly. We could see a renewed focus on building those resilient supply chains that reduce dependence on China, especially in critical sectors like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
It's about ensuring that the U.S. and its allies aren't vulnerable to economic coercion from China.
So a potential second Trump term in the Indo-Pacific could really be all about hard power, strategic alliances, and technological competition. Sounds like there was a lot to unpack here. So we're going to pick up this conversation in part 2 of this deep dive. Don't go anywhere because we're just getting warmed up. And while you wait, if you find this deep dive helpful, hit that subscribe button and give us a like.
All right, so, we've been talking about this potential shift in the Indo-Pacific under a second Trump administration, and I think it's time to really zoom in on one particular country that's really at the heart of this whole puzzle, India.
Right. India's got that, massive border with China, and they've had their own share of tensions with Beijing over the years.
Exactly, and with India's growing economy and military capabilities, they're really becoming an even more important player in the region. Our sources suggest that a second Trump administration might see India as a really crucial partner in their strategy to counter China.
Yeah, I mean, they have a lot of, shared interests there, and India's got a lot to offer in terms of, strategic partnerships.
Absolutely. We could see increased defense cooperation between the U.S. and India, maybe even, more technology sharing and joint military exercises. And let's not forget about the economic side of things. India is a huge market with a lot of potential for growth, which could be very attractive to a Trump administration focused on economic nationalism.
So it sounds like, India could really benefit from this closer relationship with the U.S., especially if it helps them to kind of counterbalance China's influence in the region.
Right.
It almost sounds like a win-win situation.
Well, it's not quite that simple. India has their own foreign policy goals and priorities, and they're not just going to blindly follow the U.S. lead.
All right. India's always been very cautious about, getting too close to any one superpower.
Right.
They've traditionally pursued a policy of non-alignment.
Exactly. So while they might welcome closer ties with the U.S., they'll also be careful not to alienate other important partners like Russia.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balancing act.
For sure. And let's not forget about, the potential downsides for India. If the U.S. takes a really aggressive approach towards China, it could actually increase tensions in the region, which wouldn't be good for anyone.
Right.
Including India.
That's an important point. If things escalate too much, it could lead to instability or even conflict, which would be detrimental to India's economic growth and security.
Yeah.
So while closer ties with the U.S. might seem appealing in some ways, India will need to weigh the risks and benefits very carefully.
It sounds like India's in a tough spot. They've got to play their cards, right, to navigate this whole complex geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely. And for those of you prepping for the UPSC exams, this is exactly the kind of scenario you might be asked to analyze. You might get a question asking you to assess the potential impact of a second Trump administration on India's foreign policy.
So UPSC aspirants, listen up. This isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the complexities of international relations and being able to think critically about these potential scenarios.
Exactly. You'll need to analyze the potential benefits and risks for India, consider the impact on regional stability, and even think about the broader implications for global order.
And remember, the Indo-Pacific isn't just some abstract concept.
Right.
It's a region with real people, diverse cultures, and a lot at stake.
Right. The decisions made by leaders in Washington, Beijing, New Delhi, and other capitals will have a very real impact on the lives of people in this region. So as you're studying for your exams, don't lose sight of the human element.
It's a good reminder that behind all the geopolitical maneuvering, there are real-world consequences.
Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I think it's important to take a step back for a moment and acknowledge that, not everyone is excited about the prospect of a more confrontational U.S. approach in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some concern out there.
Some people worry that this kind of strategy could lead to a new Cold War with China.
Right.
Further dividing the world and increasing the risk of conflict. Others argue that it's too focused on military power and neglects other important issues like climate change and global poverty.
So there are valid arguments on both sides.
There are. And it's important to consider all these perspectives when you're forming your own opinions. Don't just take our word for it. Go out there, read more, talk to people, and think critically about these complex issues.
That's what the deep dive is all about. We give you the information and the different perspectives, but it's up to you to do the hard work of analysis and critical thinking, especially if you're planning to ace those UPSC exams.
Exactly. Now, with all that said, are you ready to move on to our final thoughts on this fascinating deep dive into the Indo-Pacific?
All right, so we've really covered a lot of ground here, from that shift to the Indo-Pacific to the potential for a more assertive U.S. strategy under a second Trump administration.
That's a lot.
It's clear that this region is really becoming this kind of geopolitical hotspot with all these major powers vying for influence.
It really is the epicenter of global politics right now. And for those of you prepping for the UPSC exams, understanding these dynamics is going to be absolutely crucial.
Oh, yeah. I can already see those essay questions forming in my head. But let's maybe break down some key takeaways for our listeners, especially those UPSC aspirants who are gearing up for those tough exams.
Okay, well, I think the biggest takeaway here is that, a potential second Trump term could dramatically reshape the strategic landscape of the Indo-Pacific. We've seen how his administration might take a more confrontational approach towards China strengthening alliances like the Quad, bolstering military capabilities in the region and pushing back against China's, growing influence.
It's almost like we're witnessing a new great game unfolding in the Indo-Pacific.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And for UPSC aspirants, it's not just about knowing the current state of affairs. It's about being able to analyze these potential shifts and their implications for different countries, especially India.
Right. Imagine a question in the mains exam asking you to analyze the potential impact of a second Trump administration on India's foreign policy.
Exactly.
You'll need to really demonstrate a deep understanding of these really complex dynamics.
You'll need to go beyond textbook knowledge and showcase your analytical skills. Think about the potential benefits and risks for India, the impact on regional stability, and even the broader implications for global order.
It's about really connecting the dots, seeing that big picture, and being able to think critically about all these potential scenarios.
And here's a thought-provoking question for all of you to ponder. What are the long-term consequences of this potential shift towards a more assertive U.S. approach in the Indo-Pacific? Will it lead to greater stability and prosperity in the region, or could it backfire, creating more instability and conflict?
It's a question I don't think has any easy answers, but it's one that's worth really grappling with as we try to understand the future of this increasingly important region.
And remember, the Indo-Pacific, it's not just some abstract concept on a map. It's a region that's home to billions of people with diverse cultures, economies, and aspirations.
Right.
The decisions made by leaders in Washington, Beijing, and other capitals will have a profound impact on the lives of real people.
That's a really important point. We can't lose sight of the human element in all of this, amidst all these geopolitical calculations.
Exactly. So as you're studying for your exams and engaging with this topic, try to connect it to the real world and think about the human consequences of these policy decisions.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
Hopefully you found this exploration insightful and maybe even a little bit thought-provoking.
If you're a UPSC aspirant, be sure to revisit your notes, analyze those key takeaways, and think about the potential exam questions that could arise from this topic.
And for all our listeners, we encourage you to stay engaged, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions about the world around us.
And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a rating. It helps more curious minds like yours discover the show.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep learning, and keep exploring the complexities of our fascinating world.